Very pleased to be joined now by Dale Tolliday and Russ Pratt, both in Australia. And just before we jump into the conversation, gentlemen, could you just take a brief moment to introduce yourselves? Russ, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Russ Pratt. I'm a forensic and counselling psychologist. I run a small private practice called Prime Forensic Psychology. Briefly, my background is about a dozen years in sexual assault centre at one of our major Victorian hospitals, and then I spent 7 years as one of the two principal practitioners for Victorian Child Protection.
Great, thank you, Russ. Dale.
Yeah, hi everyone. Dale Tolliday. I'm Senior Clinical Advisor to New South Wales, which is a state in Australia's public health system's response for children with harmful sexual behaviours. I've been working in this space exclusively for about 35 years. My background's in social work and law, and have found the evolution of services in this area to be extremely interesting and important, especially around today's topic.
Yes, and I want to jump right into that when we're talking about sibling sexual abuse being deemed a health issue rather than a criminal issue, and that different approach. And I know, if I'm not mistaken, there are still aspects that are perceived to be criminal, and criminal charges may be pursued and all of those things. But the approach that you are more often taking is looking at sibling sexual abuse as a health issue. So, and I know you are both, well versed in research, international research and programs and things that are going on there. So let's talk about that. How do you think approaching sibling sexual abuse as a health issue changes let's start with the society's perception of sibling sexual abuse versus seeing it as a crime, just a pure crime, like we look at other forms of abuse. How do you think that changes society's perception? Russ, what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, look, it makes a massive difference in terms of, being able to actually work with young people who have engaged in sibling sexual abuse, right at the grassroots level. And I've talked about this quite a lot, that, both Dale and I have been around an awfully long time. Dale a little bit longer than me, older than I am. So, I guess that an example of this is that, when I started this work in the late 90s in a sexual assault centre, it was very new work, and these programs were just being set up in Victoria, which is sort of the low southeastern state of Australia, one of the most populous states. But effectively, because it was at that time a criminogenic framework, a criminal matter for anyone over 10 to engage in sibling sexual abuse, we would get parents who would call up the sexual assault centre looking for assistance for their children when it was discovered, and we would have to tell them that we would have to make a report to both Child Protection and police, and also the likely implications of that. And of course, many of those parents would hang up. They would just hang up straight away. So we never actually saw probably the majority of the young people that we would have liked to have seen. I'm veering a little bit left of your question, but I think it's important to set it up at that grassroots level that, once we sort of moved into a developmentally appropriate, I'll call it a child developmental health framework, we were able to do things that we hadn't been able to do before. And one of those things, of course, was to hold both a young person who had engaged in sibling sexual abuse and a young person who had been, the victim or the subject of that behaviour, and a parent didn't have to make a Sophie's choice, one or the other. Which one am I going to privilege here in terms of, or which one am I going to actually have a response to, without feeling like they were sacrificing one of their children. So just at that very grassroots level, that was a major, major shift for us. And of course, it was the old saying as well, that the field of dreams, once you build something like that, they will come. And of course they did. Our referrals, went off the scale, and it was really, in that very late 1990s, early 2000s, that we really started to, to be able to build programs that looked at this from a developmentally appropriate framework, which I think, really was that major shift and really resulted in a system we have today. I'll hand over to Dale, I think, to, because he can sort of fill in what I haven't there and more.
Yeah, we experienced similar here in New South Wales. My observation of the justice response is it sort of drives families into going in different directions for both young person, and it drives parents to have to make choices early before they've had time to even process what's been happening in their own family. When parents find out that there has been sexual abuse of one of their children towards another child, within their responses to that, generally huge challenges to the sense of themselves as parents, deep sense of shame, stigma. In different parts of our system, they can be very sensitive to that being reflected in the way people respond to them. And when they're driven to go to different service sectors, so for the older sibling, who's generally a boy in a justice setting, he's heading off, living somewhere else usually, getting some sort of service from that system, whatever that service delivers, and then another kind of service for the other child. The parents are frantically commuting between places, etc. Generally, there's very little space for them to process their own stuff that they need to deal with, and they have a high level of expectation to be there 100% for both of those children. And in the midst of all of that, if there are other siblings, they tend to get forgotten. So a health and wellbeing approach actually should be having all of the service responders connecting with each other, together with the family, working out the plan of how to respond and to just slow things down at the start, make sure everybody's safe, and then start the process of moving into the critical areas that need to be understood. And I'll just jump in with one further common thing that parents are really wanting to know as soon as they find out is, why did this happen? And we have to say to people, we don't know why, but we need to look really closely at actually what happened and how did it happen. That's the first stage. And being able to see that and hold that together for parents is a huge issue, because which parents want to hear about this stuff? This is a nightmare for people when they find out this information.
And because it's such a nightmare, it makes it easier to push it back and deny it, or to excuse it and try and ignore it, or whatever, right? So taking that more developmental approach must soften that. It's sort of like we need to look at this development stage. We need to look at where this child is in their maturation, where they're going, and deal with it from that perspective, rather than only looking at quote unquote right and wrong behavior.
Yeah, in some ways, however, when we think about, what you just said, Nancy, and also what Dale said, and I said, so for instance, I had a parent once many years ago say, I wish he'd just killed someone. This is so shameful for our family. Of course, we don't agree with that, but the concern is that for some parents, it would be easier to punish. It makes sense to them. It's kind of over. If we punish him, he won't do it again. And so, we had to do a lot of work, and we still have to do a lot of work with that parenting group, because of course, regardless of what we think about punishment is not treatment. And in some, ways you could say, look, if you do wrong, okay, punishment may or may not be appropriate, but don't mistake treatment and punishment as being the same thing. So, we've continued and had to continue appropriately to educate parents that this is a developmental issue, and it fits nicely or fits well into a child developmental and sexual developmental framework, and also a trauma framework and things that we'll talk about later. But it's a slog for parents. It requires commitment from parents, and it requires them to go through their own journey as well, which again, I'm sure will be part of this conversation.
Oh, for sure. And also, I think, though, I'm sure that you must get some pushback from survivors and the child who's been harmed. In as much as I did some cursory research looking at, I belong to some Facebook groups for adult survivors, and the terminology is very important to a survivor, particularly an adult survivor who's had this storyline and had this experience and has been holding it for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And the venom of around terminology is, I was abused. I was not harmed. there was this idea that this is a developmental thing, is a nice convenient excuse. I mean, we need to take that perspective into consideration as well, right? So it's part of the tricky nature of not only just discussing the whole subject, even the term sibling sexual abuse is for society, for the general population, a relatively new subject or phrase. One might think of the term incest or sibling incest, but even that is, the sibling incest one is relatively new. So we get into this quagmire of terms and definitions and all that really creates an obstacle for society as a whole, and parents in particular, to wrap their heads around this. So even taking the more developmental approach, you must still be running into these obstacles that are causing underreporting or minimization of behavior. I can't imagine that there are parents. Well, I was going to say something that wasn't quite termed properly there, but even with this shift towards a developmental framework and coming at it from that viewpoint, there's no doubt you run into the same sort of obstacles, though, as you were alluding to, Russ, about parents and the difficulties they have in any event. I wish, quote unquote, I wish he would have killed somebody. It's also a black and white problem.
Sure.
So is that true? Is you still see these obstacles based in terminology and language and stuff that's getting in the way?
Sure, language, is contentious, and both Dale and I are involved in a national reference group, and we've spent a significant amount of time, debating language and framing language, and it's important. There's a couple of things I guess I'd respond to, Nancy, in terms of what you said, and that is that, on the whole, we are dealing with young people who have engaged in sibling sexual abuse, and we're engaging with them not historically, even though, of course, that is something that happens as well. But we're engaging generally with young people who are, within sort of 12, let's say 12 to 18 months, just, ballpark figure of these behaviours being engaged in. So, we're probably dealing with, young people who have been victimised that may be anywhere from sort of 4 through to, let's say 18, just as a broad figure, and generally teenage boys who are generally sort of 13 to 18 as well. And so what we hear more than, the venom, what we hear a lot, of course, is, look, I really love my brother, but I certainly don't want this to happen, or I'm really angry at my brother for what he did, but, I still love him. So, what we've actually had to deal with a lot of the time, of course, and particularly when we removed young people automatically when we found out about these behaviours, was the statement, look, I wanted this to stop, but I didn't want this to happen. Because what happens then, of course, is we get young people who've been victimised who feel they hold a responsibility for splitting the family. They feel they hold the responsibility for mum crying in the corner and dad working 2 jobs and never having a meal together. And, so we have to be very careful that we don't sort of mistake when I say mistake, but we don't mix an adult historical victim survivor perspective with what we're seeing at the moment, because what you said definitely holds water, but we need to be careful of what we're hearing on the ground and what we're actually treating and how we respond to that. We've all become very, and again, I don't want to sound facetious, but I think it's important to say we've become very good at selling our work. And what I mean by that is we're very comfortable with responding to what is said to us or put upon us, because we have to be. We need to be respectful, because this is people's lived experience. So we don't want to be what I call the the language police. We don't want to be saying to someone who's had a horrific experience or a victim experience, well, you can't say, that's not how we, that's just where we're at. That's just not going to happen. On the other hand, we need to be careful that we don't exclude young people and their parents from treatment through our language. Yeah.
Yes, it's as you said, it's a contentious issue, and I think unfortunately it's going to be one that goes on for some period of time. Particularly, I think, and Dale, I'd love your thoughts on this. With sibling sexual abuse having this gray definition about it, about what is normal curiosity versus problematic behavior versus abusive. Now, I had a conversation earlier with somebody who said that, you know, parents, they quite often have that inkling, and they kind of know what is not appropriate behavior, and the notion of a gray area is convenient. A gray area in the definition is convenient, but it is also true that sibling sexual abuse is not as cut and dry as some other forms of abuse in terms of what behavior constitutes abusive behavior. So a parent abusing a child, there's no gray area there. Like, and we just know what is abuse and what is not in that dynamic. And the same with, you know, other forms of child abuse. The lines are pretty clear. But in terms of the definition of sibling sexual abuse, I personally believe, because it is unclear to many parents, it is difficult for them to recognize or admit or acknowledge what may or may not be going on. Do you think, Dale, that we're anywhere closer to having something, may not be universally acceptable as a definition, but it is at least something that not only the professionals and academics can, for the majority, agree upon, but then we can send that message out to society and parents and educate them on, you know, this is where we are, this is what we know. Do you think we're getting closer there?
I think we are, without heading into it from a definitional framework. So what we've found here that's been reflected, I think, in New Zealand and in other parts of the world, I think similar in Victoria, so is that if we create a system that provides parents and families with knowledge about services and makes a very clear statement and about harm, and it's safe for them and their children to be able to, and when I say safe, that they're not going to be split up, the kids aren't going to be incarcerated for years, the siblings who weren't engaged in the behaviour aren't going to be labelled in the same way as other children elsewhere, etc. So it's an emotional, psychological safety, safety and community. Parents stream into our services. They're not there denying this behaviour and having confusion. So we've my services that I'm with are now 25 years old, and we have sort of an open door policy of who can access. Consistently for 25 years, 50% of the people that come in our doors are families where it's sibling harm. Now, we're using the term harm. I just want to say to adult survivors, abuse is abuse. If it's abuse, it's named. Okay. The thing with abuse, though, is that it's got within its definition things to do with the motivation, intention, and capacity of the person who's doing the behaviours. We know that if you use those definitions, you exclude stuff, and you exclude experiences of children being harmed by siblings on the, you know, and excluding on the basis of the siblings' capacity to understand something about what they're doing, when in fact, if you're being harmed, you're being harmed. I've never met somebody who's been harmed who's been in any doubt about that. They've had doubts at the time in terms of their developmental capacity to recognise that their apparent choice was not a choice, that it was an unequal relationship, that the notion of, you know, an older sibling saying, I'll stop if you tell me to stop, etc. That's actually a part of the dynamic that traps siblings into silence and into a sense of being complicit. And professionals trap siblings and families into this by talking about this being behaviour between siblings. It's not between siblings, it's behaviour of one sibling prevailing over another. So we use the term harmful to be a broader base. It includes abuse. And part of the journey for families, for the young people themselves, is if it's abuse, to face it, to face that if they've been focused on this in a way where they've understood the nature or something of the nature of how come it's wrong, and they've gone ahead with it, etc. And sadly for us, in terms of sibling behaviour, and you mentioned sexual development, etc. Even with an open door system like we've got, we're not seeing families typically where there's been one event or two events. We compare our sibling cases with non-sibling cases, and there's a difference in the amount of time that this has been going on before it's been disclosed or discovered. The behaviours tend to be more frequent, a higher number of behaviours. 20 years ago, when we compared sibling and non-sibling, we saw that sibling matters because of familiarity and the duration, etc., that they were more likely to be more intrusive behaviours. We've got a thing out there called the internet that's got a lot of sexual material on it, freely available. My personal view, and I'm sure Russ will jump in on this in a moment, but that's influencing the behaviours the kids are becoming aware of. So we're actually seeing no significant difference between how intrusive the behaviours between siblings and non-siblings. It's bad, you know, it's significantly intrusive. Problems for siblings in terms of dealing with this, they tend to not have anywhere they can be safe at home, because typically this is happening in their own spaces, like bed sleeping spaces, but could happen anywhere at home. The dynamic typically separates them from access to a safe person, a parent. So the process for sibling who's being harmed is very difficult. And as a child, somebody's being harmed, they're trying to develop a narrative to understand what's happening. And so when Russ was talking about siblings not wanting their siblings to be away, they just want the harm to stop, they're still connected, etc. That's a child position, and that's where we would be starting, working with the child who's been harmed. Over time, the narrative evolves, and by the time a person becomes an adult and looks back on their experience, what they'll say about that experience is probably going to be a bit different, but it may also depend, and this is where we need our longitudinal research, what the response of the family was and what the response was of the sibling who did the harming. You know, we're hopeful that there can be something that doesn't have a survivor of sibling sexual abuse being in a position of a perpetual negative framework of their experience and their family. I'm not suggesting that relationships are able to be totally restored to pre-harm for all young people, but we see a substantial amount of that if we are able to engage early. It's really clear. It's really clear. Adult survivors. I started with adult survivors, and nobody in this field working contemporaneously with children should be engaging in any kind of discussion with an adult survivor, telling them that their description of their behaviour is something that needs to be shifted.
Just before we move on to another topic, maybe put forward something that might be worthwhile considering, because of course the experiences of adult, survivors of childhood sexual abuse of our generations may hopefully be very different to, sadly, this phenomenon is likely to continue. So we acknowledge we are most likely going to have future survivors of sibling sexual abuse and harm. But, what we perhaps do is perhaps we have the opportunity to change the adult survivor's perspective. So, and I'll give you a couple of examples of this. One of the things I've been very privileged to have experienced is over, the last 25 years is to have some of my young men, because it's the majority are young men, but have come back to me at 20, 30, 40, and in a couple of cases at least, they've come back at crisis points in their family, such as the death of a parent, etc. And in a number of instances, they have been there, come back to me with their brother, for instance, that they victimised at the time. And what struck me was that when we're talking to parents and to perhaps our young people are working with, we might want to ask them to consider the future, that, how is this going to impact in the future, and what might be, helpful to consider the future. And what I say, and it's a little bit of a cliche, but I say that, in the past, what I call these terrible, dirty secrets, I think is how one survivor described it to me. And, the power of our work might be to reduce that secrecy so that young people who have been harmed have the choice of how they approach that relationship through the lifespan, but the secret is no longer there. And as I said, one young man who was victimised, who was sitting with his older brother, who was just sort of nodding, and they'd both done a lot of work with me, and now they'd be 45 and probably 41 now. I saw them when they were 10 and 13. That's maybe a bit young, but you get the gist.
Yep.
And the young person who victimised said their parent had died, and that was the context of why we were speaking. And he said, I'll use the word effing. I think people know what that may refer to. He said, sometimes I really effing hate him for what he did to me, but, you know, he's my brother and I effing love him. And the brother was just sitting there nodding. And, you know, what the sort of the realisation was, of course, is that this younger brother had not only the right, but, you know, was able to, you know, hate what had happened to him, but to verbalise that and to have honest discussions with his older brother as adults. And so they were able to come together without just being completely destroyed by this. And I think we need to, you know, if we're talking to parents who might want a quick fix, you know, there's something to consider about perhaps when those parents are gone. And what I mean by that, we may have a group of survivors who have a different experience. It may be that unresolved child sexual abuse becomes, dare I say it, somewhat resolved childhood sexual abuse. In other words, the part that destroys families. The experience is always the experience, but the ability to have open and honest conversations, if one chooses with the victimiser, I think is a powerful part of our work.
Russ and I have got the benefit of working contemporaneously, you know, so with these events. The shock for parents is not knowing this has been happening in the lives of their children, and parents often trying to hold it together, saying, what does this mean about us? What does it mean about our family? Am I responsible, etc.? Now that gets complicated when there are actually things that both or all of the children have experienced as adversities. Now the family might have, as a whole, experienced some adversities, some socioeconomic, loss of somebody close, etc. But how conflict's managed within the family, and whether conflict is gendered and may actually be something of violence within the home, particularly if it's of one parent towards another, or of one parent in their style of disciplining children, etc. These are really all important things to understand how things are working in the lives of the children. So, and I'm not meaning to say therefore those parents have caused this, but it means to actually understand this behaviour through the lens of the children's experience. When we respond, we're looking at those elements because developmentally, siblings engaging in sexual behaviours with each other is not normative. It's not part of the pattern. There are layers of or usual behaviours for siblings at a very young age, you know, body awareness, gender development, discussions about sex and sexuality, etc. The sibling relationship is actually a developmentally significant relationship through childhood and into adult life. Some researchers have identified that siblings even have their own code and language for each other. And you know, there are siblings who know as adults that they had conversations with each other that only they understand. They're attuned to each other around those things.
Yes.
In terms of attunement, though, responding contemporaneously, one of the things for parents to face is the issue of how attuned they are and how able they are to be attuned to their children. And it's complicated because of the adversities that may have been there for the children, and then it gets extra complicated if the parents themselves are carrying their own traumatic histories as well.
That's true.
Yeah, so
and
the response in the service system needs to be empathic and expansive, if you like. And when I said earlier, slow it down, I really mean slow it down at the very start. And we talk in this part of the world, I think it's global now, about being trauma-informed in our responses. At the very early stage, people need time to process the information that they've received. We talk about integrated services. Personally, I think the child who's been harmed must be afforded a separate space for processing their own experience that needs to be integrated in care with parents. Very difficult for a child who's been harmed if they're seeing the same counsellor who's seeing their brother who harmed them.
Yeah.
So it's up to the service providers to work out how to do that. Now, the younger the children, the more potential there is for some of those things to be more closely aligned at the start. But if we're talking about kids in their high school years, they need to be given, and it's developmentally appropriate as well, that individual space and also having a way of integrating stuff. So the child who was harmed, after a period of time, usually wants to know what their brother's saying, what the story is, etc., as an example of something that they might like to have as part of integrated practice.
So do the parents, Dale. I mean, that's the other thing, isn't it? You know, it's not unique to the child. And just before you go on, you know, it's important as well to sort of acknowledge that we're not just going to have these, let's say, you know, the ease of, you know, the discussion, the two kids, the two young people coming up, the siblings. You know, this is a family concern, and it's going to be looked at within the family context and within a, you know, family lens as well. So, you know, we've worked hard so that parents don't just bring their children and drop them off and then walk away. Back to you, Dale. Sorry, I just want.
Yeah, no. I was actually heading right down that path, Russ. It's
good.
Well, we've had, because our services are all tied together in the same system, but we've got child sexual assault services and our services for young people who harm. We've been able to experiment with how to respond, and we've found that clearly, if we just characterise it as two sides, you know, of services, if they can respond together to the family, to the parents at the outset, it gets closer to being trauma informed right from the word go. And if they can provide the opportunity for families to have choices about how they receive their services, where they receive them, etc. Usually for the families we see, since disclosure is the first time anybody's given them a choice about anything, because they've been told what they have to do as it unfolds. And as it unfolds, it's out of control. It's like it's intrusion into the family, things are out of control. The older the kids are, the more likely they need to be in different places for a while. Generally that means the child who's older and more able should be moving to another place. Where are they going to go? It might be going into a care situation, but ideally it's family care. And if it's, say, going to live with grandparents for a period, that means the nuclear family's secret, which they find shameful, has another layer out into a family, and the family might have a bit of a history of relational disruption, etc. So the work is very specific and intense, but as we've been moving down this pathway, we've been developing more knowledge. We can anticipate these things more and work through with families on those issues. Families respond generally very well. I should also say, modern life has many different family configurations. So we're not just talking about biological nuclear families. People live in very different ways, and if parents have split and have repartnered, children might be living across 2 or 3 different households. What's home might be different. If it's a child who's come with a parent into a relationship with another parent who has a child who's been harmed, the crisis generally at the start is who stays and who goes, and does the parents' relationship survive? When you can imagine what that means in terms of being able to have time to drill into sort of what's been happening for the children and for the family.
Yeah.
And managing one's own distress, of course, as a parent.
Yes, there's that part too. Before we begin to wrap up, I wanted to just touch on something very briefly. And then I want to also ask you both about, you know, we talk a lot about the impacts of sibling sexual abuse on the family, on the person who was harmed, the person who caused the harm and stuff. I want to ask you both in a moment about the more hopeful outcomes that are possible, the impacts of the interventions and the impacts of the approaches that you take, you know, the quote unquote success stories. But I want to come back in other conversations with people. We've briefly talked about this too, but that modern living that you talked about, Dale, and the access that children have to the internet and to pornography, and for example, the the website that even reports that one of the highest downloaded styles of pornography is brother-sister incest, and they quite happily put that on their lists of downloads. Let's just look at that a little bit more about, you know, parents know I need to monitor my children's, you know, interactions with the internet and use parental controls, and we also know that sometimes that's really difficult to do for parents and stuff like that. So what do you think, parents that are listening to this, they know that the internet is fraught with all sorts of really not good stuff out there that can really negatively impact their family and their children in particular. What do you want them, how would a parent change their behavior towards the internet now? Like, what do you want to see them do? Either one of you.
Look, I've done quite a bit of qualitative research in this area, particularly the impact of porn. And with a colleague of mine, Sarah Fernandez, we sort of developed what we call the savvy consumer model, which, you know, it's effectively, it's a simple model. I mean, it's hardly a model, it's a set of points that my view is that we should work as hard as possible with any means at our disposal to protect children who are prepubescent from internet pornography. That's it. And when I say internet pornography, I mean all pornography, but let's face it, you know, the internet pornography is the big ticket issue. So anything you got to do, you know, because, you know, my research and my practice knowledge tells me that the prepubescent brain just doesn't process this stuff well at all, and it leads to all sorts of really quite significant concern. So post-pubescent children, the research indicates by around 14 or 15 that the majority of young people, you know, 98 to 100% in most studies, have seen pornography or been exposed to it. So if we can't stop it, we have to work with our kids to have them understand that this stuff bears little relationship to actual sexual and romantic relationships. In other words, it's pure fantasy. And so I'm not advocating for kids to look at pornography. I want to be really clear about that at any stage. But I think that we are powerless to stop it. So we must work with our kids to say, look, this is acting, and it's pretty poor stuff. You know, if you're going to base your relationship on this, you're going to be in trouble. And so to assist young people to really, as the name says, be really critical, savvy consumers, and have open conversations about it. But of course, you know, the internet is fraught with danger. So it's not just online pornography. You know, it's actually teaching kids internet safety from about the age of 2. When now my you know 2-year-old granddaughter can do this and swipe. So
yeah,
that's, you know, broadly what I would say. We used to say, you know, and any parent that's still working on the rules of internet safety from 10 years ago is way out of date, you know, because now every child has at least one device from about 8 or 9. They're trained and given them at school to do their homework. They're sent off their room to do their homework. You know, what do parents think they're going to do up there, you know?
Yeah.
So, yeah, in some ways we have to really have that 2-tiered system, prepubescent, post-pubescent. Prepubescent kids, just to finish the point, you should treat the internet like it's a dangerous intruder in your home without, you know, being too silly about it. But kids should not be just given unfettered access to the internet before they're post-pubescent.
And post-pubescent, the guidance and conversations that parents can have with their children about what they're seeing or what they may see if they haven't seen it yet, sort of thing, and the realities of what pornography is, because as you say, it's a form of entertainment and it has no basis in reality, and to review and look at pornography as if this is how you should style your relationships as an adult, I mean, it's just setting kids up for failure in that regard, for sure.
It is. Apparently it's very popular. They keep making more of it. So, you know,
well,
there you go.
I live in the country where the largest pornography site is based, and not my claim to fame, I have to say. It is disturbing. And I mean, when I was a kid, there were shelves with magazines way up high that the little ones couldn't reach, and they still got the magazines down from time to time because they had an older or taller sibling or something, and get me one of those magazines, or they found mums or dads or something in a cupboard somewhere, so they were still exposed to it. But yes, if we don't have these conversations, then it's just an illusion.
Here's the thing, Nancy, just so that what you're describing and what we're all about, within a sort of a decade and a half, probably we all know what you're talking about. Those magazines showed women standing naked, or lying naked with no graphic flesh and no penetration and no multiple penetration, etc. That pornography that we saw, that we probably saw half a dozen times across our our adolescent life, is just like driving your car to the shop and going to the moon. That's the difference.
You are correct. It is a completely different world now, and I agree and applaud the idea of just no internet access to young kids. It's not necessary, particularly unsupervised. Yes, you might have an internet connection to play games, like an insignificant game or something, but anything else is just
good supervision.
Good supervision.
Can I just say that in this subject area, there is a enduring human interest, particularly by adolescents and through adulthood, in sexual content. So we know that. And the historic place of magazines that were regulated with what they could put in them then became videos, that then became DVDs, and then the internet has opened this up in a unregulated way. In terms of regulation of access and content, that's for governments. They can do it if they choose to. They can certainly make sure there's nowhere on the internet about how to make a bomb. And if somebody searches a site to do that, they'll get a knock on their door not very long after they're doing that. So it's technically possible, but it's big business, and that's there. One of the things that we're noticing now is that compared to 10, 20 years ago, when we had parents struggling with understanding how the devices work, we're now starting to see parents who grew up with online access to this material themselves. And it has shaped partly how they have developed as human beings, their sexual behaviours, their practices. At the difficult end of the spectrum, it may actually be that a child's parents have got one parent imposing behaviours on the other parent that they've taken off the internet.
Very true.
School curricula in our part of the world are being revised at the moment to put more and more content into this space for education for kids, etc. And we've identified that there's a gap, and so people are working at the moment on materials for parents to give them some sort of coaching and resources about how to talk with your kids about this stuff, because it's not an easy topic. And my personal view is those resources need to include amongst them how do parents talk with each other about this stuff before they start talking with their kids. And I think if we could get that in place, we'll be in a whole lot better, because if the parents can be on the same page about this, and then if they're speaking with their kids, they're creating an opportunity to have a proximate relationship with their parent, with their children, and they're more likely to be in a position of being able to have relevant conversations. Even if a child says, fingers in the air, don't tell me, I don't want to do this, etc.
La 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 la.
Yeah, we want parents to be able to be parents in this space, and
absolutely.
And so that's a work in progress at the moment.
Yeah. And I've said in other places in this event that, we're talking about supporting parents and having different kinds of conversations with their children. And it's driven by the conversation of sibling sexual abuse. But I've also, and others have said as well, it's never going to hurt your relationship with your children to learn how to communicate with them openly and honestly about any subject, because, the percentages show that there are many households where sibling sexual abuse will not occur. But talking as if it might, and having those conversations will create that relationship that can talk about any subject, hopefully, across the lifespan too, as your children get older and they have other life events going on that they can go to their parents or even their siblings about and have open and honest conversations with. So it never hurts for parents to learn how to have these difficult conversations, to get educated, to acquire the knowledge, to listen to the experts, and then to learn themselves how to have those conversations. There's never a bad thing coming out of that. But as I said, I wanted to ask each of you as we wrap up. You have worked both of you in this domain for some time, so you will have seen families come through your system and sort of come out the other side, for want of a better phrase. So there's a lot of negative things that result from sibling sexual abuse for every member of the family. But when somebody becomes aware that this is going on and they seek intervention and they get it, despite it being daunting and a little frightening or very frightening and all the rest of it, you've been around these families to see them coming all the way through the intervention. So what are the positive impacts? Do you have any stories, or, you know, without disclosing anybody, obviously, but do you have any examples of what can happen that is really beneficial to the family? Dale?
We would both have many.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be kind of odd if I didn't. But,
yeah, kind of.
Look, I don't know that I've got examples that I've got permission to speak about, but I'll talk to the themes, if that's okay.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the families that do really well are where the parents are able to hold a constant position where they retain an awareness that the sibling sexual abuse occurred, and that they're clear about who's responsible for the behaviour and are able to care for that young person. Now, caring for that young person, so we're talking about brothers as our persona here, caring for that person relieves the sibling who was harmed from having to be in that space and be responsible for mediating what happens for him. That's the parent's job. The parents also, if they can hold the reality that this is stuff that happened to the child who was harmed, that creates space for both of those young people to be cared for by their parents and get on with their development. It gives space for the story of each of those young people to be validated and to not be placed in a position of having to do anything other than face and deal with their own stuff. We particularly are looking for the children who've been harmed to not have expectations to have to be a particular way. I think it's entirely okay if a child who's been harmed gets unexpectedly triggered from time to time and get distressed. What they do need is a way of having that validated and responded to and understood. It can be very difficult in families when those things happen, because it may not be that the sibling who harmed them has actually done something that's been harmful at that time, but there's been a trigger of some kind of reminder, and that can sneak up on people. We would hope over time those things diminish, etc. The key thing is for the child who was harmed that this is not something qualitative about her or him. It's something that happened to them, and it's not defining the whole of who they are. Parents' job again, it's not defining the whole of the sibling who did the harming as well, and need to recognise that and give him space to sort of grow and develop with that, and for him to take a position of developing a narrative that includes going forward, I did do this, and as he becomes an adult, that was when I was a kid, and these are the circumstances. That's the way I can explain it now. Absolutely, I would not do anything. And if we could get to the high water mark, to have that sibling have a level of attunement to their adult sibling who they harmed, that's not placing expectations on that person, that's respectful and listening and attuned. I mean, that's the ideal outline.
Russ, you too have got lots of experience in this. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, just to finish off what Dale was saying, that story I told earlier, that was certainly the outcome that was very clear you know, that end part where there were no expectations on that brother that had been victimized to be anything or to act in any way. You know, that young man had the I think the, you know, the space and the safety to be how he wanted to be with his brother, which I think was very important. I think that, you know, good treatment programs and good responses to these behaviours really allow families to space to actually look at what is going on in that family. You know, what is happening in a family system that may, you know, inadvertently, I'll say promote, I'm not sure about the wording, you know, it's not causal, but, you know, what's the dynamic that's going on in that family that these things sort of emerge and these things continue on, perhaps. And, you know, to allow families to really look at their own sort of family system, you know, in a way that's not blaming or shaming, and in a way that they're not working on the clock, you know, that they do have the space to do that. Something a little bit different, you know, if you've got any listeners here that, you know, that are basically in the field and they have intake workers, you know, please train them to do a couple of things when people ring, and that is to be very, very succinct and tell the parents that ring up that they've come to, if this is the case, they've come to the right place, that they have a treatment program that's inclusive of everyone in the family, that generally the outcomes are overwhelmingly positive, and that, you know, that in a period of time they will feel very different to how they feel right now. If, you know, with those simple, you know, messages, which is probably all a parent can take in at that time, you set up the work to allow everything Dale talked about to happen. And so on. I think that's really important as well. How we start will impact how we finish, if that makes sense.
I totally agree, and yes, you know, and quite often the start is fraught with frenzy, and that can be so to everybody, parents, children, the other siblings, when, you know, you might have police swoop in, particularly if it's if you know, there's a criminal aspect to it, and all this stuff is going on, and the head just spins. And so I think you make a very good point there. And Dale, I know when we were speaking before, and something that you had said to me, I want to repeat only because I think it's so important, that you know of families who come into the system very distressed and also and almost very angry, perhaps, towards the sibling who caused the harm and stuff like that, and then after dealing with the whole system and going through the process and the intervention, actually come out the other side feeling proud of their family, which sort of alludes to what you were just saying as well, Russ, that you're going to feel different in future. Because I want parents in particular to recognize that should sibling sexual abuse ever be disclosed, there are people you can contact. There is help out there that is non-judgmental, that is curious help. You know, let's look at the family, let's see what we can find, and then here are the resources that we have for you, and let's walk with you. I want parents to really know that message. And as you were just saying, Russ, you are going to feel different in the future. Ideally, let's prevent sibling sexual abuse. We all know that it's never going to be totally eradicated. I think that would be an illusion. It's been with us for millennium. It's going to continue. But to get society and family structures to a point where children who are having thoughts about anything that one could consider to be problematic, abusive, harmful, would feel that they can go to a parent, and that parent can find resources for them without everybody freaking out and, you know, running to the hills. I would like to think that that's a possibility for the future. So as we wrap up, gentlemen, it's been an absolute privilege to speak with you today, but do you have a final thought or anything that you think we should have mentioned that we haven't, or, you know, something that you'd like to wrap up with?
It's a big subject area, Nancy. I think we've hit some headline issues here, and hopefully it provides the window of information and hope for people that is the design of the project.
Yes, and you know, just to mention at this point that in the resources pack there are links to resources in your part of the world, and so people can continue their learning and continue their knowledge seeking after they, finish listening to the library of content from today. We have just touched the nail and the top of the nail here and skimmed across different subjects, but there is more information that people can get from the resources pack for sure.
Yeah. Can I also say there's a little pressure in my part of the world to get to respond to this and get it done quick. We want to, in our system, the language is we want a timely and proportionate response, so proportion to the needs. What does that mean?
Yeah.
I think with sibling sexual abuse, it's not a quick fix. I think people need to take some time, and if you've got the ability even to do it over more than a year, it's not weekly intensive sessions, it's just a duration of connection with people who are walking alongside the family. We typically start wanting to work with people weekly for a period of time, and then we'll make it less frequent, move to fortnightly, and then we get to the tail end where we're monthly or whatever. But we find we need to actually allocate a longer period of time as a time frame, so that we don't have expectations that this is going to be done in 6 sessions or 10 sessions.
No. And I would just say that, sorry, keep going.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, basically the importance of sort of perseverance. And what I would say is that at least in this country, or in, I shouldn't say broadly this country, it's a big country, but most jurisdictions have a system for working with this very issue. And if you as a parent, make contact and, you feel that, you haven't got the expertise in that contact, or that you're told that there's nothing out there, persevere, because there most definitely is. And, that's an important thing to think, that you don't want to try once. Hopefully you'll get the right response. But I think that, we don't want people to drift away because they felt that there was nothing out there for them. That the message is that there is. Yes,
there is.
And it's improving and increasing all the time. So that's what the message that I would give to parents.
Great. Yes. And I think with more events like this one, and the research that is continuing, and the different events and opportunities that are coming down the pipe, there'll be even, I think, more resources made available. I think the political will climb a little bit as well, in other jurisdictions and other parts of the world too, for the governments to be supportive of, programs and funding and research and all that sort of stuff. I just want to thank you both for taking the time that you have with me today. I really appreciate your time, and also your perspective, and particularly a bit of insight into an approach that is a little bit different, that seems to be getting, very good results, and seems to be supporting society's willingness to normalize this conversation and to talk about what is obviously a very difficult subject to talk about. So I really want to thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Nancy.
You're welcome. All the best, Nancy.